guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, a really big welcome. My name's Jenny and I mainly make lifestyle content on this channel, so that pretty much means I make videos about everything and anything. Some of the topics that I cover are things like disability, chronic illness, mental health, a bit of Disney, fashion, beauty, some travel when we can do that kind of thing. So hopefully there's something on here that you'll enjoy, and I really hope you'll stick around to watch this video. So this video isn't one that I had planned to make, or certainly not planned to make just right at the moment, but some data came out yesterday and it just felt like now was the right time to make a video to talk about it. And yeah, so I just wanted to communicate some of that data to you. It has been in the mainstream media, but it's easily missed and it's, I think, really important. So what I want to talk about is the way that disabled people have been continually failed and forgotten during this pandemic, and yeah, a little bit about Scope, who is a charity for disabled people, and some of the work that they're doing to raise awareness, to try and get us listened to and to try and get us the support that we need. So I apologise if I look at my phone a lot during this video, but there's a lot of mentions of sort of statistics and information that I just want to make sure that I'm getting right because it's really important. So basically yesterday the Office of National Statistics released some more data about how disabled people have been affected during the COVID pandemic, and it says that 6 in 10 deaths with COVID were those of disabled people. And when I saw that come out, I was really upset. I was angry, but I wasn't surprised, and I think that's the saddest part, because we already knew how disproportionately disabled people were being affected by the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, and I knew I'd done a little bit of research asking when we would hear sort of more recent data, and I knew it was coming out this week, and so I perhaps naively hoped that things would look a bit better, but I think realistically I knew that things probably weren't going to be much better. And then when the data came out yesterday about 6 out of 10 COVID deaths being among disabled people, it just broke my heart. And as a disabled person, it is a terrifying statistic to know how vulnerable disabled people are in this pandemic, and that's what has made me want to make this video, because I think it is so important that this is talked about. Only now has this been picked up by mainstream media. You know, we're almost a year into the pandemic, and it's only now that I have seen it being talked about on mainstream news, in newspapers, which is, it's just so wrong. These kind of figures should result in public uproar. You know, there should be anger amongst the general public that disabled people are being disproportionately affected like this, but there isn't. People don't really talk about it. The only people I have seen talking about these figures are disabled people. I've looked in the comments on newspaper articles, and you know, there's a lot of disabled people talking about how upset they are about this, how angry, how scared. And then there are some comments from people who have very ableist opinions and very, very harmful views of why disabled people seem to be dying more disproportionately than non-disabled people. And it's horrible to watch, it really, really is. And so I wanted to make this video off the back of those statistics to try and raise a little bit of awareness of what Scope are trying to do, because they are one of the main charities who are really fighting for disabled people at the moment, and I think it's really important that as many people as possible know what they're doing and know how to support them. So before I start talking about what Scope are doing, I think it's really important to mention that when the Office of National Statistics commented on these statistics, they said that an important part of the increased risk was because disabled people were disproportionately exposed to a range of generally disadvantageous circumstances compared with non-disabled people. So I've seen quite a lot of comments saying that people, expected disabled people to die more than non-disabled people, because, people assume that if you're disabled, you are classed as extremely vulnerable, or that you have problems with your immune system, and that's just not true. Disability covers a huge spectrum of conditions and various different things. It does not necessarily mean that it affects your immune system or that you have a health condition at all. Somebody with a disability may have lost a limb or something like that, and that on its own is not going to affect their immune system. So people saying that disabled deaths are expected, are understandable, I think really need to understand why disabled people are dying disproportionately. It's not necessarily because disabled people are, medically more vulnerable. It's because disabled people for years and years have been ignored, discriminated against by society, not given what they need to be able to be on a level playing field with non-disabled people. So I think it's really, really important to make that clear, because, a lot of people have just said, well, what can we do about it? They're disabled, they're going to die. And that is just not the attitude to have. So I'm going to move over on the screen a little bit now, because Scope have produced a timeline of injustice about how disabled people have been forgotten through the pandemic. And I'm going to put the different pictures here and talk through them a bit. I feel a little bit like I'm like a teacher or something, like giving a PowerPoint presentation, but this just seemed the best way to do it because it's a lot of information, and I think having the graphics there will be helpful. But yeah, all these graphics were produced by Scope. They're not produced by me. I'm just talking about them. So their timeline obviously starts in March last year, when the pandemic officially started in the UK. So on the 19th of March, the coronavirus bill was published, suspending the Care Act. I'm not going to go into each individual part too much because that's going to make a very long video, but basically suspending the Care Act put disabled people at a huge disadvantage and a huge risk. And then on the 23rd of March, many disabled people were left off the government shielding list. The government shielding list was done by, very specific diagnoses and things like that, but that meant that a lot of disabled people were left off it. And by being left off the shielding list, it meant that disabled people were finding it harder to access things that they needed to access, because they were still needing to stay at home, or they couldn't go out, but they couldn't access things as they usually would. And then on the 26th of March, disabled people started to report that they were unable to book supermarket deliveries. So this is an example of what happened when they were left off the shielding list, because people who were shielding were given priority supermarket delivery slots. And so disabled people who weren't on that list found it a lot more difficult to get these delivery slots. And, a lot of these disabled people would have relied on online deliveries for months or years before the pandemic, and now they couldn't get them, and they had no other way to get their food and groceries and things like that. So we then go into April and May, and on the 14th of April, deaths in care homes were omitted from official data. So when the death data for COVID started coming out, they didn't count the deaths in care homes. So that discounted a whole population of disabled people, whether they were older disabled people or younger disabled people in care homes. None of those deaths were being recognised by society as a whole. And as a disabled person, that feels very scary and very unfair, because, these deaths mattered just as much as any other death, and it should not have happened that way. And then we get to the 6th of May, and drastic shortages mean that a third of healthcare professionals and half of personal assistants are not wearing PPE during home visits. This put disabled people and the people caring for them at huge risk, because they didn't have the protective equipment that they needed to look after both, the disabled person and the carer. And I think a lot of disabled people and carers will have caught COVID through this way. PPE was a huge problem across the board to begin with, but it wasn't even recognised that home carers and PAs and things like that should be prioritised to be getting any PPE, and so this obviously put disabled people at more risk. Going into June, on the 19th of June, official figures show that almost 2/3 of people who have died from coronavirus were disabled. So this was the first lot of statistics from the ONS that came out back in the summer, showing that 2/3 of people who died from COVID were disabled. And this was not talked about. I barely saw it in any mainstream media. No non-disabled people that I know of spoke about it. It was just like it wasn't happening. And despite that coming out and calls being made for things to be done to try and stop that from getting worse or to continuing, nothing was getting done. It was just ignored. The deaths of all these disabled people just didn't seem to matter. So we then go to the 22nd of June, and the government said that shielding was going to pause from August, which sparked fear and uncertainty among disabled people. All of a sudden, we were told that shielding was going to pause. There seemed to be disagreement from doctors and medical professionals, and no disabled people were being consulted to hear what our views were, how, what we were concerned about, what things could be done to help us. It was just shielding stopping, basically get back on with your life. And it's not that easy when you're disabled and you are at higher risk of COVID to just go from shielding to going back to some sort of normality. So then on the 1st of July, sanctions were reintroduced into the welfare system. So basically during the first lockdown, the sanctions in the welfare system were paused. So things like renewing benefits and going to appointments and things like that was all paused because of the lockdown and for people shielding and things like that. In July, those were all reintroduced again. So despite a lot of disabled people that I know still deciding that they needed to shield because there was still COVID about and they wanted to protect their health, all of these sanctions came back into place. So disabled people had to start making decisions about, do I go out and put myself at risk so that I can, get the money that I need to buy essential things, or do I stay at home and miss my appointments and not have any money? Which obviously it's not fair. You shouldn't have to choose between your health or your life and being able to afford the basics that you need to live. Then on the 17th of January, the government announced plans to relax working from home advice, which obviously rung alarm bells for many disabled people. If you were shielding, or even if you weren't told to shield but had chosen to shield, all of a sudden you were being pushed back into work, and very little consideration was given to people who were vulnerable and who were concerned about their health and wanted to try and still work from home. All of a sudden it was, no, we're trying to push you back into work again, despite knowing that it was perfectly possible to work from home in a lot of jobs, because that had been proven in the first lockdown. So there we go. And then on the 24th of July, masks were made compulsory in shops, but there was a huge lack of public awareness about the exemptions, and that resulted in disabled people facing abuse. I heard of so much abuse from disabled people, not from disabled people, but disabled people told me about abuse that they had been subjected to because they couldn't wear a mask, or because they had worn a mask and they'd had to take it off because they were struggling to breathe. Even now there is still a huge stigma around the exemptions to wearing a mask, and I know a lot of people who are disabled and unable to wear a mask are terrified to leave their homes because of the abuse that they've suffered. Going into August, on the 1st of August, shielding paused despite just 5% of disabled people feeling safe about the changes. So, I mean, that is a tiny percentage of disabled people who felt safe. And again, we weren't consulted, we weren't offered any kind of support. It was just shielding was done and you were expected to get back on with your normal life again. And then on the 27th of August, disabled people were overlooked as a major drive for people to return to their workplaces. So much the same as what I was talking about before, about returning to work. You know, disabled people just were not given accommodations to make work safe for them. Then going into September and October, in early September, the government announces a campaign to get people back to work, offering few reassurances for disabled people who are more at risk of the virus, which pretty much says it all, what I've already talked about already. On the 12th of October, the new tier system came in across England. Many disabled people in higher tiers were left without support. So when we went into that tier system, it was basically the equivalent of lockdown for people in the higher tiers, but there was no support packages put in place for disabled people, so people who couldn't leave the house, people who needed care, all that kind of stuff. There was just nothing. You know, it's carried on throughout the pandemic and it was still happening in October. And then by mid-October, research found that 7 in 10 disabled people had lost income, were furloughed or had been made redundant. I don't know what that figure is like compared to the rest of the population, but knowing that disabled people have a harder time getting jobs in the first place, it's obviously going to have had a huge effect on a huge number of disabled people. We then come to November, and in early November, research shows requests by disabled people to work from home, be furloughed or redeployed are denied. 1 in 4 are left with no choice but to go to their workplace or quit their job. I mean, again, you should not have to choose between your life and your work. You know, protecting your life and staying alive versus working. There are plenty of adaptations and accommodations that can be put in place to allow somebody to work from home or to be redeployed somewhere else, but these were continuously being denied despite the, you know, there was a still risk of COVID to people. Then on the 5th of November, the second national lockdown started, but shielding was not introduced. So we were put in lockdown, but unlike the first lockdown where at least some people were shielded and got the support through that, there was no shielding, so nobody got any support through the shielding programme, but obviously still needed to get groceries and support and things like that, and it just wasn't there. And then on the 18th of November, I think this is the most heartbreaking one actually for me, at the Prime Minister's question time, Boris Johnson rejected that disabled people were being disproportionately affected by coronavirus. That one for me upsets me most because there was plenty of evidence that showed that disabled people were being disproportionately affected by COVID, and for it to just be rejected by the person that is running our country is just, I just can't comprehend it. And that rejection and unwillingness to listen to me, you know, just put more disabled people at risk. So we then get to December, and on the 3rd of December, a vaccine for coronavirus is approved and the rollout begins. However, many disabled people with underlying health conditions have not been prioritised for vaccinations. This is a huge thing. You know, this data has come out showing that 6 in 10 deaths of COVID are with disabled people, and the vaccine priority list is supposed to be prioritising people who are more at risk of death, but a huge number of disabled people have been left off the priority list. I know so many disabled people who are having to try and fight to be put on the priority list, and when you're disabled and you have health conditions and, you know, you're struggling with health and disability in general and trying to just live your life, you don't then want to be fighting to be vaccinated to try and give you a little bit more protection because you know how at risk you are of dying if you catch COVID. And I think it's something that needs to be urgently looked at because, you know, in light of the new figures that have come out, it needs to be sorted like ASAP. So we then go to the 11th of December. And government research shows that people with learning disabilities are 6 times more likely to die from coronavirus. I mean, that is huge, 6 times more likely to die. And yet there is so little support in place. It has barely been, I don't even think it has been acknowledged by, you know, the powers that be. I don't even know what to say about it, because it just breaks my heart that number is so high and yet nothing is being done. So we then move on to the 22nd of December. And the Prime Minister responds to Scope's open letter but does not recognise what disabled people face daily or the urgency of the situation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that open letter in a minute, so I won't go into too much of that now. So then we go into January, and on the 4th of January, the third national lockdown began and shielding was reintroduced, but without some of the vital support available during the first lockdown. So we do have shielding again at the moment, but as it says, like some of the support just isn't there. It's been cut back and disabled people are suffering as a result. And then it says at the bottom that disabled people are struggling to survive. Just 1 in 10 have been able to get the support they need from their local council and the UK government. It's just 1 in 10 people have managed to get support. It's just not good enough. I don't know what else to say. It's not good enough. So I mentioned that Scope had written an open letter to the Prime Minister. They handed in that open letter on the 17th of September. It had 30,696 signatures, and it included a call for a clear plan to factor disabled people's needs into the government's response to the pandemic. The Prime Minister did respond, and he referred to supporting 1 million disabled people back into work, and also referred to the National Disability Strategy. However, his response didn't respond to the call that Scope had put out directly. It ignored it, and his response didn't acknowledge what disabled people are facing. So it basically didn't give the response that was needed. So Scope have now written an emergency policy briefing which highlights the urgent need for targeted support for disabled people to try and mitigate the worst impacts of the pandemic and of lockdown. So in their package, it says that the package that the government put out must include protection for disabled people's finances, protection for disabled people's health, and support for disabled children and their families. So, for example, I spoke about the vaccine prioritisation. That's something that Scope want to be looked at to make sure that disabled people are being prioritised regardless of their age or their condition for the vaccine, and also that all routes to the vaccination are accessible for disabled people, because that is another problem, that you might be prioritised for the vaccine but it may not be accessible to get it if you're disabled. So what can you do to help us? Michael Gove is the leader of the team that's responsible for most of the issues that are affecting disabled people. We want to convince him that emergency support is needed and that the government need to act now, because if they don't act now, it's too late. It already is too late, but it needs doing now. So I'm going to link a few links below, but one of them is going to be a template of a letter which Scope have written, which you can put your name and everything in and send to your MP. It only takes a few minutes, and it just is highlighting this emergency support package that Scope want putting in, and asking your MP to take it to Parliament to bring it up with the people that it needs bringing up with. So yeah, it's only going to take a couple of minutes of your time. If you do one thing from watching this video, I would ask that you fill in that form and send it to your MP, because the more people who contact their MP, the more they will realise how important this is, how much it needs to be looked at, and that it needs to be done now. So please, I don't like begging, but please, for every disabled person in this country, please fill in that form, send it to your MP, and get them to listen and to save the lives of disabled people. And then looking at other ways that you can help, I'm not going to kind of go into this in huge detail because I don't want to make this video too long, but basically the best thing that you can do is be a good ally to disabled people. So things like listening to disabled people's voices and what they say and not dismissing it and, you know, taking it on board. If you go anywhere, keeping a lookout for disabled access. You know, are there ramps? Are the doors wide enough to get through? Are the aisles in the shop wide enough for a wheelchair to get through? Are there disabled toilets, and is the disabled toilet clear so that it can be used by a disabled person? There's so many different things, and I do understand that a non-disabled person may not necessarily spot, you know, every adaptation that could possibly be needed, but some of these basic ones are easily identified, or not, as the case may be. So if you see something and you think, well, that's not accessible, you know, ask, speak to them, say, what is your disabled access policy? How, you know, what do you do for your disabled customers? Or if you're an organisation, talk to your bosses about what they do to make sure that they're hiring disabled people in their business. I think just people speaking up for disabled people more, because for so long it has felt like it is just disabled people fighting for ourselves, and we need other people to do it for us as well. It shouldn't just be disabled people fighting for these rights. Anybody can become disabled at any point in their life. So anyone that is not disabled, I would just really urge you to be a good ally to disabled people, because you just don't know what will happen, what's around the corner. And even if you never become disabled, it should still matter to you that disabled people are still in 2021 dying disproportionately in a pandemic. It should still matter that disabled people can't get their shopping. It should still matter that disabled people can't access, you know, the shops, the theatres, the cinemas that you can access, because the access just isn't there. It should still matter that disabled people are not being listened to and are being forgotten. So I was going to finish like I usually do by saying I hope you've enjoyed this video, but actually it's not a video to be enjoyed, it's a video to raise awareness and to get things done. So I hope you have maybe taken something from this video that you can go forward with and do to help disabled people in this country. If you have and you'd like to see more from me, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. Also hit the notification bell, that means you'll get notified every time I upload a video so you don't miss anything. Leave me a comment, let me know if you have been affected during this pandemic as a disabled person, what you think of what I've said in this video, whether you've signed the thing from Scope yet. And also I'm hoping to do some videos in the coming weeks and months from the perspective of people with disabilities about what it's like to be disabled during a pandemic. So if you're interested in being part of those videos, drop me an email. I'll make sure that my email is in the description below so that you can drop me an email and just let me know that you're interested, and I can let you know a little bit more about that. Also come and follow me on social media. My links are in the description below, but I'll put my Instagram and Twitter up here. Those are the two platforms that I'm mainly on, so please do come over and say hello. I'm responding to comments as quickly as I can. It just depends what my health's like and how much I can get done, but I appreciate every single comment and message that you send, and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. So please do come and say hello, because it would be lovely to talk to you, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!